The Nikon 80-200 f2.8 was first introduced in 1978 as a prototype. Since then, there have been 8 iterations of this lens. The one which I will focus on today is the 4th generation 80-200mm f2.8 autofocus D version. It was first produced in 1997 and is still in production at the time of the making of this presentation. I will not bore you with a list of device specifications. You can read them on screen or on the Nikon website if you so desire. How did I learn of this lens? A couple of years ago, I had a conversation with a professional photographer from the Philippines at Cinco de Mayo. He was rather vocal about how good the 80-200mm was. At the time, I thought he was referring to the 70-200mm VR2 version. Instead, he produced what I thought was an antiquated lens from his camera bag. He insisted I give it a go. I put my prejudice aside and tested it for the day. Admittedly, one was taken aback by how this lens portrayed color, compression and bokeh. Assuming that you are holding the camera and lens correctly and use the right settings, the overall image afforded by this lens is more pleasing to the eye than the current 70-200mm f2.8 VR2. For those of you that own that lens, you will concur to the fact that the overall image that is given by this lens is a little bit on the flat side with muted colors. At the risk of gushing like a Japanese schoolgirl at a J-pop concert, so impressed with the overall output of the 80-200mm lens that I purchased my own copy the following week. Please note that this lens is designed for outdoor portraits, event photography and wildlife. One could use this lens in a sizable studio as its closest focus and distance is about 4.6 feet. However, I would personally opt for an 85 or 105mm prime. In terms of focus and speed, it is not the Usain Bolt of lenses, but it is adequate for what it was designed to do. My estimate is that it will take between half a second and 1.5 seconds to lock onto the subject. When compared with the newer VR2 version, I would say it's about 20% slower. This is something you may overlook or not be bothered by once you have grown accustomed to this lens. I find that using this lens wide open at f2.8 is a little soft. My recommendation is that you commence at f3.2. Once you have attached the lens to your camera, be sure that the switches are in the same position as the ones you see in the photo before you. Failure to do so will result in the camera displaying an error message. With that said, let's have a gander at some example images taken with this lens. Please note that these photos were taken with predominantly sub 18 megapixel cameras and scaled down. As I stated earlier, this is a jolly good lens. Now let's address the pros and cons. Construction. This is without the most solidly built 80 to 200mm lens to date. If push came to shove, you could lay someone out with this lens if you decided to brandish it as a weapon. Color rendition. Color that is afforded by this lens is more rich and superior to that of the newer 70 to 200 VR2 version. Compression. Backgrounds are compressed very nicely and, dare I say it, on par with or better than other lenses in this focal range with added depth. Sun stars. These can be provided by this lens along with lens flare circles, and these can be used for added creativity. You could say it is also an absolute bargain and can be appropriated second-hand for about £300 or new for around £500. For those of you in Portugal or America, expect to fork over a little more. Now for the cons. Weight. This may be a bit much for some as it weighs about 1.3 kilos. Despite that, it is in fact lighter than the later versions of this telezoom. It is a screwdriver lens, so you will need to possess a camera that has an internal focusing motor to operate this lens with autofocus. Higher-end DX cameras or FX cameras are required. Focusing speed. It's a titch bit slower than the VR2, and it will be noisier when focusing because it doesn't have a silent wave motor. If you are one for outdoor portraits and street photography at a distance, you could do a lot worse than this lens. Speaking for myself, my portrait process is more methodical and deliberate, and thus the 80 to 200mm suits my needs as a portrait photographer. Word has it is that Nikon will cease manufacturing this lens sometime within the next year. Therefore, if your requirements are similar to mine, I'd pick up this lens quick smart. Yes, it is an older lens, yes, it focuses a little slower, and no, it doesn't have VR. However, the overall image you'll receive is worth the trade-off. The 90s, it would seem, was a better decade for certain things, that being a decade for decent hip-hop, things were less plastic in nature, and men were more like men. Far too many Nancy boys are walking around these days in pink clothing and with lady-styled handbags. If you've been shooting for 6 months or more, you should be able to hold this lens steadily at shutter speeds of 1/80th of a second without VR. And a lot of you will be complaining about the lack of VR in this lens, but I think that it isn't really an issue here. I digress. If overall image rendition is more important than features and appearances, then procure this lens. It has almost prime-like qualities in how it produces the images. The bottom line is, the Nikon 80 to 200mm F2.8 ED is a bargain for what retailers are asking for it. Buy this lens while you still can.